Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Stanley Adams. I am from the Department of Commerce in Kansas, and I have been, over the past 5 years, leading a state broadband initiative, which is where the SBI comes from. And I will tell you more about that shortly, but I wanted to just briefly say hello and find out if we were going to have a good conference. One of the real big metrics I have, that we have as a collective group planning the conference, to know that we are going to have a good conference, is that we have a lot of interactive engagement with our audience. That would be you all. So, are you ready?
Yes.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I don't speak a lot to big groups, but I am very pleased to be here. And one of the things that I learned is that it's always better if folks respond when you're talking. So I appreciate you working with me on that one little thing, which I'm going to leave that alone, which bodes well for us having a very good conference. What I'd like to do first thing this morning is to tell you a couple of things about what to expect over the next 2 days and how we got to here. So to wit, the conference goals and objectives. You all know them because you're here. But in essence, as you notice the theme, the state of broadband and the road ahead. So I must confess, when we came up with the title for the conference, it was not with the idea that we would start on the same day as the State of the Union address. It gives a little bit more pressure to me here, but it's not going to be that kind of a conference. However, it is intended to show, to let you all know a lot about what we've done over the past 5 years, kind of where we are right now, the state of broadband, and where we need to go forward. And we're going to have a lot, I'm going to share a lot about where we are to set the stage, but the real work is going to come from the collective group here assembled, which is to figure out, this is more of a question, what is the road ahead? And throughout the conference, you will hear and share perspectives about what that needs to be. As I'm sure you all would agree, we live in really, really interesting times when it comes to the subject of broadband technology. Anytime you can't go a week without some major announcement coming out. And did anybody see the space? We're going to have internet in space, came out yesterday. Some billionaires are going to do some satellites, and they're going to figure out how to make sure billions of people have broadband. That's the road ahead a little bit further than what I think we can probably accomplish today and tomorrow. Just saying. So that is, so the state of broadband, and that has a lot of different meanings, and I encourage you all to share your thoughts or challenge the premise of things as we go through the conference. The panel sessions you will find in the program are designed around 4 pillars: economic development, education, public safety, and healthcare. All of those are really important. They're not the only ones. They're the ones that we've worked on the most or tried to emphasize throughout our broadband initiative for the state. And we've tried to design it in as inclusive manner as possible. The foundation upon those pillars, if you can just picture the graphic, pillars, foundation is collaboration. And my pet peeve is silo busting. As I'll share a little bit later, it is a recurring theme that we've seen in working on our project is that there's a lot of efforts being done in terms of improving broadband access, improving the network, but oftentimes they are very silo-centric. So healthcare, there's federal funding for that kind of program with Connect Health, and then there's education, there's Connect Ed, and oftentimes there's opportunities to collaborate online. So we are really trying to emphasize cross-pollination, if you will. So please do try to expand your comfort zone if that's appropriate, and enjoy the conference. I want to, beyond welcoming you and telling you a little bit about that, we have made possible with your support. So some of you know what I'm about to say. There are 2 areas that are really important I want to call out. Number one, thank you sponsors. We had some great success with sponsors for the conference, and I want to thank you all, Pixius, Sprint, Cox Communications, AT&T, Kansas Fiber Network, Advantage Engineers, as well as a host of others on our digital highway sponsors like McBride, Black & Associates, TCT, Unite, and CenturyLink. Please join me right now in giving them a round of applause. Our program, the state's initiative, is federally funded, but because we had sponsors, we were able to put this type of effort forward. And without them, this would be a different conference. And y'all would not have coffee, and y'all would not have linen on the tables. So we really do appreciate each and one of you who have sponsored, and those of you who have been supportive of the program in other ways as well. And one other point about this being made possible, so we also want to thank the NTIA, because it was an NTIA grant that funded the state's initiative over the last 5 years. And this conference is in many respects the capstone to that 5-year project, as that grant program ends at the end of the month. So we are very much appreciative to the NTIA and their forethought in putting together a program the way they did. And again, I'm going to come back up and tell you about that in a minute. But I know that I saw Lynn Chadwick from the NTIA, and I'm thinking Laura Reedon might be here as well. Where are you? All right, there's Lynn. Thank you. Give a shout out for Lynn. We appreciate the work that they've done, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. In terms of what else to expect in the road ahead, did anybody get that kind of play on words? Angela Seifer from the Shelby Coalition is going to come up and introduce our next speaker. I mentioned that our foundation was collaboration. We collaborated for this conference with the Schools, Hospitals, Libraries, Broadband Coalition. And you're going to hear a little bit more about that. But what's really got us excited about working with Shelby, one, they're really good at putting conferences on, and that's how I first became aware of them. But their whole focus is around collaboration amongst community anchor institutions. So let me have Angela come up and share with you a little bit more and do the next introduction.
Hi, I'm your logistics person. So if you have any logistical issues, come to me. So I'm here to keep us on time and keep things flowing. So a couple logistical items: bathrooms. This way, just keep walking, you'll find them. You'll also pass some great maps that we have on the wall. Those are the same maps that our mapping folks have at their booth, and they would love to talk to you about those maps. I believe you all have the Wi-Fi code, meetings 15. If you have any issues with Wi-Fi, let us know, because broadcast broadband conference. The wiki. Let me talk to you a little bit about the wiki. So everyone last night should have gotten in their email inboxes an invitation from pvworks.com. This is the wiki that we are using for this conference. And what we have on there is a page for each session of the conference. So the speakers, some of them have putting their presentations up there. There's some extra materials up there. So if any of your colleagues couldn't attend and would like to attend, they'll be able to access this stuff as soon as you can. Side note, you see the nice cameras around the room. We are recording, and those will be available after the conference. So for the wiki, you all can edit the wiki. So the reason you were given access is not so you can view, but so you can actually edit. So you can view without logging in. But you do need to respond to that email that you got to create a password, and that allows you to edit it. And the reason we're asking you to edit it is because we're encouraging you to put your notes on the wiki. So if you're taking notes about what you're hearing, share those with others, right? And so then they can see what it is that they do. So at the top there, Andrew over here is showing you where you can click on edit, and you can click on view. So if you're in that edit button there, this means you can add notes. So don't go changing session descriptions. That would be really funny if we're a little bit, and then people would be notes. But do please add in your notes there. If you have any issues with the wiki, ask at the registration desk. Andrew and I are your top wiki users, but any of us really can help you figure it out. If you're on social media, KS Broadband, pound KS Broadband. We put that at the bottom of your documents in the orange, right there, so you would remember. So that way we can all be talking to each other, and those outside can be talking to us here. I think that's it for logistics. And so now I get to introduce John Windhausen, the Executive Director of the Shelby Coalition. John has worked in the telecommunications field a long time. He worked for the FCC, he's worked for the Industry Trade Association, and now he's running the Shelby Coalition, whose job he's going to tell you about. And I'm very excited and honored to introduce John Windhausen.
Thank you very much, Angela. It's a great pleasure to be here. Boy, this is a great time to hold a broadband conference, isn't it? Holy cow, there's so much going on. Not just the fact that the president is going to talk about broadband for the second year in a row in the State of the Union address tonight, but we've got an FCC E-rate decision, net neutrality, community broadband, fiber, deployment projects, wireless auctions coming up. It's an incredibly vibrant time for broadband policy and for broadband implementation. So I really congratulate all of you who I know are working on this from several different perspectives. And I want to second Stan's thought about collaboration. That is really what the Shelby Coalition is all about too, is bringing people together to find mutual ways to solve these problems. So having said all that, with all this broadband activity and all the excitement, the problem is that we still have a broadband problem, right? We've made enormous progress over the last few years, but 1/3 of American households now don't have broadband at home. And that's even a higher percentage who don't have broadband in rural areas. So there's a problem of getting homes connected with basic broadband, but even more so, and that 1/3 has kind of stabilized over the last year. We've seen some increases, but not as much, not as great enough progress as we would like to see. And part of the problem too is that it's not enough anymore just to be connected. We have to start worrying about the capacity of that connection. So we're moving to a fact of the state of the world. If you really want an adequate broadband connection, DSL is probably not going to be good enough. Satellite is probably not going to be good enough in the future. You need a much more high capacity connection. And that's what these conferences are all about, trying to stimulate greater activity and greater investment in high capacity broadband solutions. The other way to look at this, and the reason we have a problem is, in some ways, the digital divide is getting worse. Even if the numbers say the same, the problem is that we're more and more reliant on broadband technologies now. You cannot apply for a job in many companies unless you have online access. You cannot go to school and take advantage of all the educational resources unless you're using a broadband connection, unless you have a broadband connection available to you. And even if you work the land, I had there's a really great little turn of phrase by the fellow from John Deere that I heard in Washington. He said, if you work the land, you need broadband. And I think that really goes to the case that broadband is so pervasive. In fact, we call broadband a meta infrastructure, not just an infrastructure like energy and transportation, but if you have a high capacity broadband network, it makes all the other infrastructures work more efficiently. And you can improve the efficiency of your electrical grid. You can have smart highways, and like if you've got a really high capacity broadband network. So that's why we're all, we encourage everyone to work together to seek this future that we need, because broadband is so vitally important to getting there. So we have an awful lot more work to do. Stanley asked me to provide a little bit of a perspective from the national perspective. Since we are the Shelby Coalition, we're based in Washington, D.C. And so I'd like to do that. Let me just give you a little bit more information about who the Shelby Coalition is, since some of you may not have heard of us before. As Stan said, Schools, Health, Libraries, Broadband Coalition. So we took the first 4 letters of our name, and then somebody started to call us the Schlub Coalition. So we said, no, we can't do that. We've got to come up with something better. So we came up with the Shelby Coalition. We've been around for 5 years, but to be honest, we began as a short-term project to support the BTOP program. And what made us really invested in supporting that program is because the program from the statutory language from the beginning identified community anchor institutions as key beneficiaries of the BTOP program. So we thought, yes, let's get together a group to support that goal. So community anchor institutions, that's why we were formed. Oftentimes there's a tendency in the broadband world to separate broadband discussions between residential and business, and sometimes leaving out the critical role that schools, libraries, healthcare providers, community colleges, community centers play. All of these public institutions that aggregate lots of people and lots of traffic need very high capacity broadband. So we try to be their voice in Washington, DC, federal policy circles, increasingly in state government policy considerations as well. We are advocates for broadband solutions that bring high capacity for anchor institutions. Oftentimes the anchor institution is the gateway to the rest of the community. So if you build out to the school or library or community college or health facility, you can then extend off of that link to serve the residential and business community. So we think there's a nice partnership there. And we are a membership-based organization, by the way. We have 43 members from around the country. Anyone who's interested in joining the Shelby Coalition, let us know, because we're in growth mode now. We just finished our strategic plan, and we're launching a new website soon, so we're really actively engaged in this field, and we would love to work more closely together with you. So let me just quickly review some of the really interesting policy developments at the federal level. I'm going to start with E-rate, of course, because that was a really huge decision that the FCC made, actually in 2 orders in July and December of last year. The July order focused on expanding schools and libraries' internal connections so they can have stronger Wi-Fi signals inside the school and library buildings. The December order dealt with the external connections, and the big achievement of that December FCC E-rate order was to add more money into the fund. $1.5 billion per year more was added into the E-rate pot of money. And I think that this is a huge opportunity. That basically that means more money is available for Kansas. The schools and libraries now in Kansas have a great opportunity to increase their applications and obtain some of that money, because if it doesn't go to Kansas, it's going to go to someone else. So there's a great opportunity here on the table that the FCC has made available. We were very pleased, the Shelby Coalition was very pleased, not only with the increase in the amount of money put into the E-rate fund, but also the increased focus on investment. And our philosophy is that if you can invest in high capacity broadband, that is an efficient investment that will generate enormous returns, because the costs of running that network will go down over time. And yet the economic benefits are huge. So we put into a report, and let me call out Heather. I just met her from CTC. If she is there, she is right there. So the Shelby Coalition hired CTC Engineering to put a report into the record to justify why an investment would be so critically valuable for schools and libraries. And a little anecdote, after the FCC decision, in December I was headed up to the FCC. They had a little party for all of those who were, like me, who were advocating for E-rate reform. And I was stepping off the elevator in the FCC, and I got a phone call from a number I don't recognize. I almost didn't answer it. But as I stepped off the elevator, I picked up the phone call anyway and said hello. And John, yes, this is Tom Wheeler, the FCC chairman. I said, why are you calling me now? I'm about to see you in literally 2 seconds. I'm going into the room with you. And he said, no, I wanted to call you now to congratulate you and thank you for the work that you did in your advocacy on E-rate reform. Because the report that Shelby put together with the help of CTC really helped to justify this increase in funding and this increasing focus on investment. Now, we weren't the only ones who submitted reports, and Education Superhighway also did a fabulous report. I think there are some Education Superhighway people here who I haven't met. Are they in the audience and would like to stand up and be recognized? Oh, great, right here. As well to justify this increase. So this is a huge opportunity now to increase the broadband capacity for schools and libraries around the country. And the FCC also took the step of allowing a state match So if the state can come up with 10% of the funding, the FCC will put an additional 10% match. So that's an opportunity for every state around the country in order to increase their schools and libraries capabilities. The Connect America Fund is another big proceeding at the FCC, which I'll mention very quickly. It's a big proceeding, but basically the FCC is trying to take the old high-cost fund, which used to subsidize telephone service, and convert that to subsidize broadband. And I know a lot of the companies have been very reliant on this Connect America Fund dollars. And interestingly enough, most of rural America is not served by rural phone companies. They're served by the larger phone companies like AT&T, Verizon, CenturyLink, et al. So the FCC is trying to convert that program, but it also has said, because of made a change also in December, that if you receive Connect America Fund dollars, you have to use some of that money to serve the anchor institutions in that region where you receive that influx of money. So this was another victory for us and a victory for anchor institutions, that now you have greater leverage. If you're a school or library or other anchor, you now can go to that provider, that broadband company receiving the Connect America Fund dollars, and say, hey, the FCC has said I deserve better broadband. Let's enter into some discussions here, and let's see if we can negotiate towards a better solution to solve our needs. So that is another opportunity. Net neutrality, I'll just mention, it's a huge topic. It's a hugely political, I think we all know. In fact, there are 2 congressional hearings on net neutrality scheduled for tomorrow, one in the House side, one in the Senate side. The Shelby Coalition is not engaged in that conversation about whether the rules should or should not be imposed. The FCC is looking at moving broadband companies and reclassifying them as a Title II common carrier service. There's a lot more we can talk about, which I won't do that today, but it is going to color a lot of broadband policies now in Washington, because the FCC is headed toward a vote in February 26th. Probably the FCC's proposal will be released around February 5th, 3 weeks before that. Congress is already drafting legislation. There's a fair chance that legislation could get through the House. Not sure about the Senate yet, but it is something to watch, because not only will it address net neutrality, but there are always the opportunities for other issues to be added on to that legislation. So that's something that we're going to be watching very closely. The 4th issue I'll mention quickly, which again shouldn't be dealt with quickly, the BTOP program, right? Stanley mentioned it. It's been a huge success. It's winding down now, but the reason I mention it in particular is that NTIA has just released a new study by ASR Analytics that looked into the economic benefits, and it's really quite impressive. This economic study found that for every $1 invested in the BTOP program generated $2.81 of economic output. So almost a 3-to-1 investment return on that BTOP money. And now NTIA has launched the next round of activity around community broadband, and has launched the broadbandusa.gov website with an awful lot of information for communities about how to enhance their broadband. So I encourage you to take a look at that as well. I could go on with spectrum reform at the FCC, FirstNet, the Healthcare Connect Fund. I don't have time to do all of that now, but I will say, despite what you're hearing at the federal level, most of this work is going to be done at the state and local level. And it's states that are taking an increasingly leadership role. You see what Kentucky is doing with a $250 million plan to roll out high-capacity broadband around the state of Kentucky. It's interesting that they're using an engineering firm that's based here in Overland Park, Kansas, to do their work. The state of New York just announced a $500 million plan to get broadband out to the further reaches, the rural areas of New York. So the states are looking at this. Iowa's looking at this too with legislation. States are recognizing that there's a critical link between broadband and economic development. Localities are looking at this too. I know I've talked to some of the folks at Chanute and Dodge City. I had a really great conversation with Rick Wagner, who's just started a new WISP, a wireless internet service provider in rural Kansas called Go Brawley. I think I pronounced that right. Rick, where are you back there? Yep. Really exciting developments right here in Kansas. And so I really encourage you all to continue the momentum and take advantage of this progress, because you're the ones who are really going to make the difference in whether a community gets broadband or not. and I really commend you for that. So just picking up on Stan's theme, collaborate, conversate, and conquer. That's the message we want you to come away with this conference today. So that's a brief overview of some of the developments at the federal and state levels. I welcome any of you to come and talk to me after this conference about Sharpie. And now I'd like to have the great pleasure of turning it over to one of the gentlemen who is really leading the charge here in Kansas. I have the pleasure of introducing Stan Ulrich, who is the Executive Director of the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors. He's been in that position for the past 3 years. He's also led President of Kansas Inc., the public-private partnership, an economic policy research agency from 2004 to 2010. He's got a background in the agricultural industry, but he's been incredibly supportive of this conference, and he really does get the link between policy, broadband, and economic growth in the state of Kansas. So it's my pleasure to introduce Stan Ulrich.
Thank you, John. It is a great pleasure to be here. And we'll see my technology starting to work. I'm probably the worst person to be talking to technology and high-speed internet and access because I'm old, as you can tell. In fact, I was reminded by a couple of my so-called friends in the back of the room. I had a Clark with USDA Rural and Jim Hollingsworth with Information Network of Kansas. The threshold for speakers must be relatively low if they're going to have me speak. That is all true. But I would tell you that I have, because of my age, I've been able to witness a lot of this stuff come through the industry. I graduated from high school in 1969. No, that's hard for you to believe. I look a lot younger than that. 1969. Internet at that time was about 80 miles in California, just to put it in some perspective. College, I took a computer class. The computer building, or the computer was in a building about this size. Had the cards. You were all too young to remember this, but had all these little cards you had to line up. I was not very good at that either. I'm in agriculture. I still farm to this day. Technology is just unbelievable. I don't steer my tractors anymore. I punch a button, which is good. That's better for me. But what I do profess to know a little bit about why this is so important to the nation and to the state of Kansas. This, you heard from Stan, the 4 pillars. I want to speak to you about the economic development piece of this. I am absolutely passionate about what this can do for the state of Kansas, and particularly rural Kansas. In the past, when you started looking at economic development, you weren't in a great big city with the out-migrations from the rural areas to the cities. You didn't have a lot of tools, you know? You started chasing things, and they were going to the big cities. Absolutely, and we'll through some of this. With this access to the highest internet, I think we can do a lot of really great things. So I come to it from a purely competitive edge. So let's talk about economic development. I know it's early. You've had some coffee, probably not enough to talk about economics, but I'm not going to talk about it in depth. So the Governor's Strategic Economic Plan, I won't go into that a lot, but it is more about building the environment for economic opportunity. You know, it just has changed so much that it used to be in economic development that we chase smokestacks. We got to get this company that's got 6,000 employees, we got to get them here, we're going to lose them to this place. I'm not so naive to stand before you and tell you there's not some of that that still happens. But we know that if we can build companies across the state, if we can add 2, 3, 5 to each one, we grow organically, that our potential for growing our state and growing our economy is exponential versus getting a company with 6,000 or 500 or something like that coming into our state. So I would just tell you that this administration, and not only just specific to this administration, but a lot of the economic entities across the nation are going to this where every business matters. Not just a few, not just the big, but literally every business matters. So when you start thinking about that, and you start talking about incentives, again, when you start chasing smokestacks, so you give $3 million to this company, you give $5 million to this company. Well, who pays for that in a lot of instances? It's a small and medium-sized business because nobody's knocking on my door giving me $3 million or $5 million to stay in the state of Kansas. When you start thinking about building an environment for economic opportunity, not picking the winners and losers, I think you start building an environment where everyone can grow and thrive, not just a few. If you think about it in a sports analogy, and I'm not much of a sports guy, so we want to build the stadium. We really don't want to pick the players. So that's as far as our strategy, state of Kansas. That's where we're headed. Now, we know in economic development, you all go to the density matters, the water cooler effect, if you will. We know that if you are working together, you have clusters, if it's software, if it's car manufacturers, there's a reason that a lot of them landed in Detroit. That density matters. You work together, your supplier base is there, your workforce is in those areas. So density really matters when it comes to economic development. Now, state of Kansas, there's a very few areas that we have great density. So we're standing in Kansas City, density of our population, our industries, and our clusters are here. Works here. Wichita, some. I-70 corridor, some. But as you get into the rural areas, that geographical reality, the density doesn't work so well. That's what I spoke to earlier about in the past. I was really not too optimistic. With the advent and with this access to the high-speed internet, it doesn't matter where we are. If we can replicate density through the use of the high-speed internet and access to that, I think we have great possibilities. So, let's talk about the economy of our past. Agriculture, and I mislabeled this other than manufacturers, that was aviation, oil and gas. How many times have we heard that? In the state of Kansas, we've got three legs to it. We've got agriculture, aviation, and oil and gas. Well, we're lucky that we have it. That's great. But I would suggest to you that our present economy is that the agriculture has morphed, continues to morph more into the rural development and agriculture. That the oil and gas has morphed and changed, continues to, into energy and natural resources. You think about now, we've got wind, we've got biodiesel, we've got biofuels, biodiesel, ethanol coming in. Now, yes, we have aviation. We're proud of that, and it's not just in Wichita, it's all over the state. But we have a great manufacturing sector in this state. It doesn't get a lot of credibility, doesn't get a lot of sexy talk around it, but we have great manufacturing scattered all over this state. Not just aviation, but all kinds of manufacturing. And we beat the nation and we beat the six-state region when it comes to the opportunity and the output of manufacturing in the state of Kansas. Professional, scientific, and technical services. This is a service sector. And boy, it doesn't get any attention. We are standing right in the heart of Kansas's greatest opportunity in reality when it comes to professional, scientific, and technical services. I'm not talking about a rooftop here, but follow along. So somebody builds, like they say, build the restaurants and those. So I'm talking about the gardens, I'm talking about the hills, bad foods. I'm talking about all this great industry that you have up in this area and along the I-70 corridor all over Manhattan. It's roughly 2/3 of our state's gross state product is this service sector. 2/3. And yet you don't get much help doing that, and you don't really get a lot of coverage for all the good things that you do. You know, Kansas City area, I know Google, you're all more familiar with that. You know, I'm not into the technology stuff like I should, but Google came here for a reason. In economics, there's a really boring thing that we do called the location quotient, and it basically just maps where industries are as in relationship to where they are in the rest of the nation. When it comes to fiber and internet and software companies, medical software, environment piece, Kansas City area is about threefold higher than anywhere in the nation. Was no surprise that Google came here, believe me. It's an exciting area for this area and bodes well, I think, for the state of Kansas. What we have to do, though, so many of these things, you'll notice the little areas where I've got them kind of covered up on each other. I think that as we move forward with these things, it can start leveraging these entities. I put the last one up here. It's called Bioscience. We've got the Bioscience Authority. And all of this technology is, we think, can be another great cluster for our state. I call it that we've moved really from the three-legged stool to the five-legged table. I didn't put this up here, but our military in the state of Kansas is very competitive. It's almost 9% of our gross state product is military. So we have the 4 Raleigh, but we also have the very high-tech security down in Wichita. We've got Fort Leavenworth out there where there's military college, people from all over the world come in and train at that military. So now we've got our president Econ. Boy, for a techie guy that can't do anything, this is really cool. Of course, I didn't do this. But I think you'll see the sweet spot here. So the goal of our economic development plan for the state of Kansas is let's do everything we can to get these folks home along. Do the best we can to help them. All right? But now we've got to create this environment for an opportunity for those people to thrive in the state of Kansas. So those things include such things as a business and tax plan. Well, you all have read and understand and probably have feelings good or bad about the business and tax climate in the state of Kansas. The thought was, quite frankly, we're going to change this environment where we build a stadium, we don't pick the players, that we get away from the great big folks and that we make a place for people to come, businesses to come, where they would want to take their capital and grow their capital in their businesses, and those of us that are here can continue to grow them. So putting the tax cuts straight at small and medium-sized businesses is by design to attract those people. So that's one area. Technology and innovation. Of course, that's what we're talking about to some point part of it today. Education. Kansas has a great educational system. We have a lot of it as well, too. We have region systems. We have a great community college system. Our K through 12. People say funding and those kinds of things. Obviously, I won't get into that. But it is recognized in the nation. Our education stands out as a very, very stellar entity. Workforce development. We now know when companies want to grow and want to come here that this is getting close to be their #1 issue. Finding talent that's trained and will do and can have the work ethic that they need. I predict, I know that the loss of jobs in the state of Kansas and all over, that's a big deal that we get those jobs back. I really think that the biggest issue ahead of us now when it comes to this part of it will be this talent. Companies can't, we can incent them or we can have them come because of a great business and regulatory environment, but if they can't find their talent, they won't come. We already are attracting people from California that want to come here. They'll move their business, but because they're people, their employees can just go down the road and get a job at the next great software company or whatever the company is. The people are staying there. They're not moving to Kansas. I think this is the next stranglehold for Kansas. Entrepreneurship, we have to get better at this. We don't startups and those kinds of innovative things that the state of Kansas we lack. We're not great at this. We need to get better. Image. This is one we're going to start working on next in the Governor's Council. And Kansans are very conservative people. We don't like to tell our own story. But I would tell you that we have a lot of really great things going on in this state. And if we don't start telling the world, telling the nation, telling the region, and most importantly, telling our kids what we have here, then shame on us. Because they're not going to come, they're not going to stay. And believe me, other states are having very sophisticated marketing and image programs, not travel and tourism, those kinds of things. Well, that's important, but about their industries and about their businesses and about the great assets and clusters that they have in their states. Infrastructure. This is what we're talking about here. So, high-speed internet access, great roads. Kansas has got great roads. So, the picture, kind of at the end of the day, that we're trying to build for. Put those great industries, great sectors that we have, build them, put them right in this environment for opportunity, where we can be very, very attractive economically. So, in Kansas, talked about the density matters piece. It absolutely requires the fastest internet access that we can get. You know, the infrastructure, water, the governor's worked on that. That is just a huge issue for the state of Kansas. We won't get into it, but you know, we're two worlds when it comes to water. We've got the lakes and streams over here, and the lakes are full of silt. And in the west, we have the aquifer, and we're pumping them at a very, very high rate. You can't grow an economy if you don't have water. Roads, obviously, that's why I'm so passionate about the high-speed internet and access to that. Before I go to this, you know that I couldn't be more excited about the Midwest. People like over top know how strong I feel about this. You know, both coasts, I love them, but they're getting full of taxes, full of regulations, full of crime, full of things that maybe aren't as great as one might want. The Midwest has fabulous attributes. I talked about our educational workforce, our work ethic, and we really are thinking that in the next 10, 15 years that the United States, that they're going to start moving from the coast, coming to the Midwest. Part of the initiatives, part of this administration initiative is to position Kansas so that maybe we won't win all of it, but that people will think about moving to the Midwest and think about landing in Kansas. That's why it's so critical that we get each one of these positive clusters coming along as best we can, build this environment the best we can, and hopefully that will be a great advantage for us. I personally see the opportunity for the town, for the population in two areas, the broadband. That's why I love the internet access, why we absolutely have to have it. I see it on two ends. I see on this end the new kids. They are so much different than my generation. My generation, we went to school, and we wanted to go to Chicago, we wanted to go to Dallas, we wanted to go to Atlanta, and get a job with a very big company. We'd have allegiance to that company would have allegiance to us, and we'd stay there for a full career. Well, that's gone. Companies now don't have near as much allegiance for their staffs. And the kids, call them kids, my kids, young men and women, come back and quality of life, time spent with their kids, and growing their families, so much more important. And so that, I think, bodes very, very well for Kansas because they love what we have. The other end of the barbell that I get excited about is on the retired side. A lot of the men and women that have lived and worked on both coasts and other parts of the country have taken really great care of themselves. Not me, but a lot of them have. So they've prospered, they've made a lot of money, they're 65 years old, and now they're looking for some place to come. And if they can come to Goodland, Kansas, or wherever in the state of Kansas, and they can get hooked up with the highest speed stuff in the world and do this, and then young kids can do this, and start a new business, which these retired people are full of exciting ideas. And we are seeing this starting to happen where they come to Kansas. So, by closing, that we just can't be left out. The economy of the past was determined and settled in large part where the lakes and the rivers were. Then it moved on to where the roads and the railroads. And I would just suggest to you that the new economies we're trying to fill are going to come and land where the innovation and the access to these kinds of new roads and lakes and streams, like what you all are working for. I think that's what we're doing and what we need. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stan. What a great name, and thank you for your remarks. Right on point and a great segue. I hope you all will agree. One of the things that really strikes me, in fact, that slide is indicative of why we collectively as a state recognize the importance of broadband and economic development. It is critical to our future, and we recognize that. The state broadband initiative has brought particular focus to how broadband needs to play a role in economic development. And I mentioned the 4 pillars. Economic development is key because I would suggest that when we talk about collaboration, and I do know some of the challenges with different stakeholders and competing interests, but everybody does agree one way or another about this or that, and then it comes down to money, and then it kind of falls apart from there. However, one place that might, based on my experience, you can't go wrong is if you're showing how to grow business, some version of how to grow business. I'm a little biased because I kind of got that business background, but I do think this is correct. A correct way if you're making the case for, as Stan mentioned, the less densely populated portions of our state are really challenged because economics are challenging, whether you're talking about broadband or whether or not a community has a McDonald's. Every community doesn't have a McDonald's. Does everybody want a McDonald's? I don't know. Presumably they want something convenient, but you get the idea. So with that in mind, my point is just to say economic development should not be missed as an opportunity for those of you who may not work in that space particularly. The stakeholders you need often only look at it that way, and I speak from experience that I've been in many stakeholder engagement meetings across the state, and I've witnessed that. IT folks talk a certain way, and economic development folks talk a different way, in some cases. So that would be a couple of thoughts I have to share with you. I'm going to get forward to where, by the way, we have a policy. The state does have a communications policy. I don't want to take up a bunch of time with that right now. I want to talk to you about the initiative itself before we get into the meat of the program and kick off the first breakout session. So there are 3 components to our broadband initiative. I mentioned earlier that it was a federally funded program that started 5 years ago. Each of the states, by the way, each of the 50 states, District of Columbia, and the U.S. territories all had some degree of funding similar to what we had. Each state was able to customize, more or less, choose which programs they wanted within the construct that the grant was issued. And in our case, as a state, we had 3 areas that we focused on. The first one was state, there was state planning, local planning, and mapping and data collection. That last one I mentioned was not optional. And the reason it wasn't optional is because one of the underlying issues to be addressed when they launched this grant was to understand supply. My take is it was about understanding supply. This was about engaging with all of the service providers, and in the state of Kansas, there's about 110 service providers in total. In addition to names you all recognize, there is a large contingent of very good rural telco providers who are in some of those small communities I was talking about and delivering really good service. So the first piece, we worked with service providers to actually understand and capture data that demonstrated where their availability was. And we had really good criteria that was consistent from a federal perspective, so we could turn that into what is known now as the National Broadband Map. So if you look at the National Broadband Map and you look at Kansas, that's our data set. If you go to the Department of Commerce website, that's kansascommerce.com, you'll see a link to the state broadband map. It is a wealth of information, and for most people it's more than you want to know, but for folks like myself and those of you who are interested in data and understanding a little bit more of the nuances, this is where you want to go. I'm going to share with you a few facts and observations about that data in a second, but that was understanding supply. And let me just say, lest I forget, I'll probably try to say it again though, thank you to all of our service providers, and I know there are a good number of you here today. We had pretty close to 100% participation. It was a voluntary program. We, in most cases, we had to do a non-disclosure agreement because they were willing to share with us data that we had to scrub and make sure it was useful. So the map is really compelling and useful, and we really appreciate that the service providers, one and all, participated in that effort for us, with us. The second area, I'm still trying to, I know you guys figured that is not really, we'll hopefully figure out how to get rid of this data. So in terms of overview of our initiative itself, so that was the supply. As you see, there was also demand. The project that we selected was in terms of state capacity building, in terms of having, building the knowledge base, building a fact base over and above the data set that we got from the service providers. We also did some statewide surveys. We focused on 3 areas, as you see: businesses, households, and, where's John? Community anchor institutions. We did surveys addressing each of those to find out what those constituency groups thought of their broadband availability, what they used it for, were their needs being met, were they not being met. And I will mention, I thought an interesting observation between supply and demand, depending on how you look at the data, but the data actually suggests when you ask households in particular, the household survey, second household survey we did, we compared what people said they had in terms of how many megabits and upload and download. We asked all those questions in the survey, and they came back with the numbers something up here. And then we went and looked at the actual data from the service providers. It was lower. So it was an interesting observation that what you have happening is people in general have a perception about what the internet access that they have and how fast is it, and what can you do with it. What can you do with it is what I think is probably the most important. And a lot of times I think there's a lot more discussion and excitement, if you will, around the speed itself. Gigabit, I need gigabit. Did I mention gigabit? I need gigabit, I need gigabit. Has anybody heard of gigabit? Lots of interesting discussion around gigabit, and I agree. I really think, if nothing else, the excitement around the common understanding of why you want gigabit is exciting because it allows some really important discussions to have across the stakeholder groups that we talked about. And I mentioned I'm pretty big on silo busting, so there's a recurring theme here. But what's really important, and what we've tried to do in our project, is to get at application of the internet rather than how fast is it. I think speed is an important quality dimension, but it's not the only dimension. And lastly, as you see, I saved the best for last, is local technology planning. We had some pilot projects that we engaged in. Here, briefly, just to recap, because I didn't want to go through a whole bunch of slides, so I'm going to skip most of my slides just so that I'm falling into that trap of trying to read to you. Unless there's somebody that can't read. Right? Okay. Interactive map. A little bit more information. There's a couple points I want to make here. Our data suggests that this is kind of the state of broadband. The state of broadband. Also, I wanted to mention Stan said something in his comments. Stan, anyway, okay. He mentioned that, okay. He mentioned, what did you mention? You mentioned Kansas has good roads. That wasn't lost on me. So I believe that's quite a good statement, and that's how we try to talk about broadband to stakeholders who may not necessarily have been as engaged. And this gets to why we found the stakeholder engagement process in local planning so important, is putting complex information in a language or context that others will understand, decision makers, keepers of budgets, and so on. So that was an important point to me, and that was kind of into our the road ahead. I'm big on puns. So another big point that we have is why I put it up here. In terms of lessons learned, where I think we are now as a state and understanding across. Again, I'm generalizing to some extent, but generally speaking, if you want to know, can most people in Kansas get broadband, have access to broadband, whether you're a household, business, or community anchor institution? The answer is yes, most likely. In fact, it's even higher than 95%. It's like, I think the latest number is 98-point-something%. By and large, even in a state with that is really densely populated in 25 of the 105 counties. Another interesting factoid I'd like to throw out for context, Kansas is about just under 3 million population. 105 counties, 80% of that population lives in 25 counties. So the important point is to kind of think about the caveats as you're working through the issues, but there are commonalities that you see come through here. Our data, this is a little bit of a disclaimer, I think most of you all know it implicitly, if not explicitly. When we talked about the data that we collected from our service provider community, we get maximum advertised speeds. So your actual mileage may vary. Wired, wireless, this gets to the point of how great the data set we have, because we're able to slice and dice across these different dimensions. I mentioned speed is an important dimension, but there's what type of technology and what's coming in the future. I like to talk about access and constructive access. That gets to the point about the 95 or 98% have some degree of access, but what happens when you change, that's based on the current minimum standard set by the FCC of 0.76 meg, or 768 kilobits per second. Today, there's a decent amount of argument put forth that you're not talking about broadband if you're not talking 10 meg, at least, and that's just in download speed. And by the way, I want to make one other point in terms of economic development. You notice that it says 768 meg down, 0.2 meg up. Well, in terms of economic development and small businesses, we've heard this over and over again, that upload speed is increasingly important. And if you're a business and you're trying to back up your data, which you should, in terms of good, safe computing practices, that upload speed in the cloud, that can be a pain point, especially in the areas that don't have faster speeds. Obviously, 0.2, some might suggest you wouldn't even try to do it because that's really too slow. But nonetheless, that's the perspective about what we have. And I mentioned just for perspective, 75% of households had access one way or another to 25 meg down and 6 meg up. Not that you need to read all of the data, but this is what this chart says is there are a lot of ways to measure wired down and up, and the percentages change, they go down basically, as you would expect. I think most of you would probably expect. They do go down. Households with 94% had 768 based on the data set I pulled from, but when you go down to the gigabit, that was it's actually greater than 3% have access to gig now, because of numerous providers in our area have been taking proactive steps to deploy gigabit networks, which I hope, as you will have noted in your programs, there are some sessions that will touch in one way or another on that point. So that's the main point, that there are differences, and when you talk about rural communities having access and rural communities having constructive access, is it affordable? Does it get what does it get done what you need to get done? I think the current theme about applications, when in doubt, talk about applications, not the techno speak. For the techies, sorry about that. All right, so let me move along here. In terms of the, well, let's just say, there you go. Think gaps, not bits. There are gaps. In terms, again, I'm just trying to touch on the state of broadband and give you a flavor without, hopefully without boring you to tears. That was my challenge in trying to present some of this information. To not go into the weeds to the point where it just needs to meet people. But you get the gist here. I mentioned in the state of Kansas in specific, over that 5-year period that I mentioned that we've been working on our program, which is SBI. There's some other acronyms out there, BTOP in particular, and BIP. That actually was across the country, $7 billion were invested. In the state of Kansas, it was $250 million in grants and loans that our rural telcos principally were able to take advantage of. And that has been, as a result, a significant increase in the amount of build out, particularly in our rural communities. In north central Kansas, a classic example. Quality of broadband infrastructure is important to growing our economy. Stan said it. What I will mention, I don't think I mentioned, you guys may have noticed as you came in, there were some maps on the walls. There are some maps on the wall. There are copies of those maps also available if you're interested. All of that is available on our website. You can customize. It's an interactive site. You can basically do some filters and get a perspective. This is one of those where if you're interested in typing in your address, it'll come back and tell you which service providers are in your community, and even tells you here's their number so that you don't call the Department of Commerce asking for broadband. That's the one thing we don't do. But I get calls. Who knew? So please do avail yourself to that. We partnered with, speaking of partnering, the department, our GIS team, state GIS team, Data Access and Support Center, took over the data collection work for us, and we're great partners. And they are responsible for producing those maps, and we've really appreciated their work as well. I don't know if they're in the room yet, but they will be here. Actually, they will be here, and I think they will have somebody at they've got an exhibit booth set up. So if this subject of the data piece is interesting to you, by all means, talk to them and talk to me, because I'm a little bit of a data geek and I like this stuff. So that's a bit of the landscape. This is my way of emphasizing the importance of collaboration through experience over the past 5 years. This is just an example for us. Interagency outreach and coordination we conducted. Obviously the Commerce Department, importantly the Kansas Corporation Commission, who has another role in understanding broadband access, and we partnered with them in terms of producing some reports that the legislature required this year. And I know the KCC is in the house. Thank you for coming. The DASC I just mentioned, Department of Education, Department of Transportation, and many others. I mentioned those pilot community projects. This is my segue to that, right? So the Kansas Hospitals Association, who will be represented here on one of the panels, at least one of the panels. CanEd, CanRen, E-Rate, you just heard about a little bit, ConnectEd. I will just do a quick plug for public safety and why that was one of our 4 pillars. It is deceptively important. Yes, you can, I think you can do that. Hold on 1 second. Public safety is important, and I encourage you to listen to that session. We've got somebody from FirstNet who will be here to participate in that panel. It's really important. I've become a convert into understanding that as a really important part of the discussion across those silos, because public safety is going to become increasingly important or of prominence. So I encourage you to take note of that. I won't go deep onto it right now, but just wanted to flag that. I mentioned the local community planning. I literally did say this for last. The point that I wanted to make, just in order to keep it brief, is we knew that we wouldn't be able to do everything that we wanted to do with the limited grant funding that we had. So what we our project, that third segment, remember I mentioned there was data collection, state planning, and local planning. So for our local planning, we set out to do some pilot projects. And the way we set it up was we did pilot projects that were demographically representative. We had a particularly rural location with Norton County. We worked with stakeholders in those. We did the outreach for it. We also brought in resources and retained the services of a company, CostQuest, and their associates helped us to develop some of this work. But Dodge City, Norton, Fort Scott, and Topeka. Topeka was the largest one at a little over a population of over 100,000. And for different reasons, we selected each of them. And we learned a lot, some expected, some not expected. One of the big thing that we did that I wanted to share, not only did we just engage with stakeholders, our whole premise was not so much you need to do thus and so, the state's here to tell you you need to have gigabit, hardly the case. What we did say was, you need to have a plan for how your community will harness the power of broadband in your economic development, whether that's in job creation outright, or is that in job creation implicitly because you are educating your children really well. However that is, the point is to have a plan. So we created a framework and structure that communities could try to corral the different stakeholders, the different community anchor institutions, to come up with their own plan, their own priorities. And that was the premise of how we approached it. And we had those 4 that we started with, and we captured a lot of data, made it available, and I would suggest on the road ahead, the big opportunity is for us to expand the number of communities that have embarked upon their own planning. And representatives from each of these communities are here at the conference, and you will be hearing from them in different ways, and I encourage you to talk to them as you may have questions. I really, it's been the best part of our project overall. This is an example of the resources that are available online. I just wanted to highlight that it exists more than to try to take a deep dive on it. I wanted to call the conference to Gigabit and Beyond. They wouldn't let me do that. I just thought it was great. Okay, so that was one of the first slides I did. That was fun. I'm going to switch over to I want to show you a couple of slides on another presentation to give you a flavor of how we treated economic development in a more, how should I explain this? I mentioned there are multiple dimensions. I also mentioned that it's about economic development. At least I suggested economic development is a great way to start any conversation. If you're going to increase jobs or anything like that, it's a great way to start. What we did, there were 2 big buckets that we tried to infuse in the pilot projects. One of them was to address what we just identified as an obvious need. We got a lot of questions about it no matter where we went. And some of you are in the room who said this. How come we don't have gigabit in our community, right? The service providers, I'm sure, have heard that if they're not already deploying gigabit. So what we wanted to do was to try to, and I hope over the next 2 days, cover a little bit of education and drive awareness and hopefully demystify some of the lingo. Is the last thing tomorrow. So if anything is going way over your head in terms of terminology, come back on tomorrow afternoon. That's where, if you didn't feel the interest in asking the question here, which if there are questions, you should just raise your hand and ask. I'm happy to do that in my last 5 minutes here. But that would be another opportunity. So we asked our consultants to do economic modeling, and we asked them to help us understand what are the drivers of building a network, right? So that the local communities could be a little bit more informed in engaging their service providers. One of the observations we had in our communities on more than one occasion was where local stakeholders, not familiar with the technology necessarily, not familiar with their service providers other than paying their bill once a month or whatever, they needed to have a context for how to engage with providers. Service providers do what they do. They deploy a network, they drive customer acquisition, and they make a profit. They are in business to make a profit. Amen. That's what they do. So we tried to come up with a way to bring a little bit more life to that, so that it wasn't a perception that, we just don't like our community. So through this piece of work, we actually took we asked our consultants to look at and this is their work. We asked them to look at some communities and to make some assumptions based on their expertise so that we could start to understand what the generic scenario would be if that were to happen. And I'm going to get to the punchline here rather than bore you with too many charts. The punchline. And Mike Wilson from CostQuest is here, so hopefully I don't say something that he says I took out of context. But I found this slide particularly interesting. In this case, it's Dodge City and Fort County. The key takeaways here, after a whole lot of work with data of specific communities, Dodge City in this case, we were able to get an assessment, a range of what impact in employment and economic value and labor income would occur over I think this was over a 10-year period. So these were informed assumptions, not just willy-nilly assumptions. They were Kansas-specific assumptions based on their work in the space. And this kind of gets at what I was saying, why I think economic development is such a critical component in discussing the importance of broadband, because it does get at this. The challenge is, if you invest $1 million today, how many jobs will I have tomorrow? Well, it's not quite, as you all know, it's not quite that simple. So that implicit value proposition has to be you have to put some meat around it. And this was a way we tried to get at that. So if you just assume the middle case, 3,400 jobs created and economic value of 600 million, labor income of 100 million, over 100 million. That's for Dodge City and Ford County, where I come from, that's not chump change. So we have a lot of data like that. I encourage you to, again, all of this is available. The economic impact, I think that's actually the last point I really want to make, because I knew I would run out of time. Bourbon County, Fort Scott is here. We did similar work for, actually, let me make my last point about Fort Scott. What was interesting about Fort Scott, the economic impact was there. Fort Scott is a community, and Fort Scott's in the room, correct me, the community is a household of 10,000? About? Anyone? How big is Fort Scott? Bourbon County. It's around 10,000. The assumption was there's no way you can make the business case for a provider to build out. Our data actually said, yeah, it would be difficult, but it was close in terms of what it would take on the set of assumptions that we used to get a community in that scenario. They've got challenges we identified in the Fort Scott example, where they have some unmet needs and they're trying to figure out how to get those needs met. And we work with them to try to help frame the discussion with the service providers to come up with a constructive solution, because as you all know, sometimes it's one thing to know that you don't have service where you want it, but another thing to actually solve it and how much money do you have, et cetera. So there's a lot of complexities. I wanted to at least highlight for you, when I think about the state of broadband, to touch on those things that we have done and kind of where we are. But now that you've got a little bit of foundation, we can go forward and try to take a little bit more of a view of where to go from here, the road ahead. So with that, let me turn it over. Are there questions, a couple of quick questions? Because I know I covered a lot, but I wanted to give you a sense of what we have done as a program and the different places that we've touched and what we were trying to accomplish. The road ahead is next, so let me have Angela come up and give you guys the latest of what we need to do next.
Stand.